I stood in the doorway of what used to be my own dining room, watching my daughter-in-law Amanda arrange champagne flutes on the table with the kind of precision that made my stomach turn. She had that smile on her face, the one she always wore when she was planning something, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was about to happen at my 65th birthday party was going to change everything. What I didn't know was that by the end of that evening, I would do something that would shock everyone in that room, including myself, and that the truth I had been carrying for 3 years would finally explode in a way none of them could ignore. But let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand how I got here, standing in the shadows of my own home, about to witness my own humiliation, and then turn it into something nobody saw coming. My name is Margaret, and I have spent the last 40 years building a life that looked perfect from the outside. I married young to a man named Robert who worked in finance, and we built a comfortable life in the suburbs of Connecticut. We had one son, Daniel, who grew up to be everything we hoped for, smart, ambitious, and kind, or at least I thought he was kind, until he married Amanda 5 years ago. From the moment she walked into our lives, I felt something shift, like a shadow falling across a sunny room. She was beautiful in that polished way that comes from money and privilege, with her perfectly highlighted blonde hair and her designer clothes that she wore like armor. She worked in marketing for some big tech company, and she never let anyone forget it. At family dinners, she would talk endlessly about her campaigns and her salary and her promotions, while I sat there feeling smaller and smaller, just a retired school teacher who had dedicated her life to shaping young minds rather than climbing corporate ladders. Robert passed away 2 years ago, a sudden heart attack that left me alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet, and that was when everything really started to change. After Robert died, Daniel suggested that I sell the house and move into something smaller, more manageable, he said, and at first I resisted because this house held 40 years of memories. But Amanda was persistent, always dropping comments about how much work the house must be, how expensive the upkeep, how I was getting older and might not be able to handle it much longer. She had this way of making her cruelty sound like concern, wrapping her barbs in silk, so that if I objected, I looked like the unreasonable one. Eventually, I gave in, exhausted from grief and from fighting, and I sold the house. The profit was substantial, nearly $800,000, and I put it all in a trust fund that I had set up years ago, a fund that Daniel knew about but didn't know the details of. I moved into a small apartment across town, telling myself that this was a fresh start, that I would learn to be happy in this new chapter of my life. But Amanda wasn't done with me yet. She started calling more often, always with some new crisis that required my help, asking me to babysit their 2 children at a moment's notice, expecting me to drop everything whenever she needed something, treating me less like family and more like hired help. And I did it all because I loved my son and my grandchildren, because I thought that if I just tried hard enough, Amanda might finally accept me. Then came the birthday party planning. 3 weeks before my 65th birthday, Amanda called and announced that she was throwing me a surprise party. Except it wasn't a surprise, because she was telling me about it, she explained with a laugh, because she needed to make sure I didn't make other plans. She said it would be at their house, a beautiful colonial in an expensive neighborhood that they had bought 2 years ago, and that she was inviting all my friends and family. I should have been grateful. I should have been touched. But something in her voice made me uneasy, a certain brittleness that suggested this party was less about celebrating me and more about something else entirely. In the weeks leading up to the party, she would call with updates, telling me about the caterer she had hired, the decorations she had ordered, the photographer who would capture every moment. She kept emphasizing how much money she was spending, how much effort she was putting in, as if she wanted to make sure I understood the depth of my obligation to her. And I played along because I didn't know what else to do, thanking her profusely, telling her she didn't have to go to so much trouble, even as a cold dread settled in my chest. The day of the party arrived, a Saturday in late October, when the leaves were turning gold and red, and the air had that crisp quality that always made me think of new beginnings. I spent the morning at my apartment, getting ready with more care than usual, putting on a navy dress that I had bought specially for the occasion and doing my makeup with a trembling hand. Daniel picked me up at 4, giving me a hug and wishing me happy birthday, but I noticed he seemed nervous, distracted, barely making eye contact as we drove to his house. When we arrived, the house was already full of people, neighbors and old colleagues from my teaching days, and members of our church, all gathered in the spacious living room that opened into the dining area where Amanda had set up an elaborate buffet. She greeted me at the door with an effusive hug, wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and she ushered me inside with the kind of fanfare that made me feel like a zoo animal on display. Everyone sang happy birthday, and I blew out the candles on an enormous cake, and for a moment I let myself relax, thinking that maybe I had been wrong. Maybe this really was just a party. But then Amanda tapped her champagne glass with a fork, calling for everyone's attention, and I felt that cold dread return, settling in my stomach like a stone. She stood at the head of the dining table, and the way the light caught her face made her look almost predatory. Her smile too wide, her eyes too bright. She began a speech about how much I meant to the family, how grateful they were for everything I had done, and people nodded and smiled, unaware that they were about to witness something ugly. Then her tone shifted, became more businesslike, and she said that she and Daniel had been thinking a lot about my future, about my security and my well-being, and that they had come to an important decision. My heart started pounding because I knew in that moment that whatever came next was going to be bad. Amanda reached down and picked up a folder from the table, holding it up for everyone to see, and she announced that they had prepared a document, a financial plan for my remaining years that would ensure I was taken care of properly. She said the words like she was doing me a favor, like she was some kind of benevolent savior, and I saw several people in the room nod approvingly, thinking this was a touching gesture from a devoted daughter-in-law. She opened the folder and began reading from it, explaining that they had calculated my living expenses and determined that I could live quite comfortably on a modest budget if they managed my assets properly. She used words like fiduciary responsibility and asset allocation, speaking to me like I was a child who couldn't be trusted with money, and I felt heat rising in my face, a mixture of humiliation and rage that made my hands shake. Then she got to the real point, suggesting that it would be best if I transferred my trust fund into an account that she and Daniel would manage jointly, ensuring that the money was invested wisely and distributed appropriately. She made it sound so reasonable, so logical, and I could see people in the room nodding, thinking what a smart and responsible young woman she was, what a lucky mother-in-law I was to have someone looking out for me this way. But I knew the truth. This wasn't about protecting me or helping me, this was about control. This was about taking the one thing I had left that was truly mine. And as I stood there in front of all those people, watching Amanda's triumphant smile, feeling the weight of their expectant stares, something inside me snapped. I had been silent for too long, accommodating for too long, allowing myself to be diminished and dismissed and treated like a burden. And in that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I looked around the room at all those faces, people I had known for years, people I had taught and mentored and supported through their own struggles, and I realized that most of them had no idea what had really been happening in my life since Robert died. They saw a devoted daughter-in-law taking care of an aging widow. They saw a family coming together to solve a problem. They didn't see the manipulation and the cruelty that had been happening behind closed doors. Amanda was still talking, explaining her plans in detail, discussing investment strategies and monthly allowances, like I was some kind of dependent who needed to be managed, and I felt something cold and clear settle over me, a kind of calm that comes from finally deciding to fight back. I took a slow breath and stepped forward, interrupting her mid-sentence, and the shock on her face was almost satisfying. I thanked her very politely for all her concern and effort, and then I said in a voice that carried clearly through the suddenly silent room that I needed to clarify a few things about my financial situation before we went any further with this conversation. I could see Amanda's smile falter, see uncertainty flicker in her eyes, and I knew she was trying to figure out what I was doing, whether I was about to meekly agree to her plan or whether something else was happening. I pulled out my phone, taking my time, letting the tension build, and I opened my email app where I had saved a document that I had prepared 3 weeks ago, the moment Amanda first told me about this party. Because you see, I had known something was coming. I had felt it in the way she spoke to me, in the questions she asked about my finances, in the way Daniel suddenly became interested in the details of the trust fund. And I had prepared myself, had contacted my lawyer and my financial advisor, and put together a complete picture of my assets and my plans, and I had been carrying it with me like a weapon, waiting for the right moment to use it. I began reading from the document, speaking clearly and calmly, explaining that the trust fund she was referring to contained approximately $780,000, funds that I had carefully invested over the past 2 years and that had grown substantially thanks to good advice and a strong market. I saw Amanda's eyes widen, saw her exchange a quick glance with Daniel, and I knew they had assumed I was helpless and clueless about money, that I would be easy to control. But I wasn't finished, not even close. I continued reading, explaining that in addition to the trust fund, I had other assets that they were apparently unaware of, including a rental property in Vermont that Robert and I had bought 30 years ago as a vacation home and that now generated substantial monthly income, and a portfolio of stocks and bonds that I had inherited from my parents and that I had never mentioned to anyone. The total value of my assets, I announced to the room, was approximately $1.3 million, and I was more than capable of managing it myself, thank you very much. The silence in the room was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop, and I saw Amanda's face go through a series of expressions, shock, anger, disbelief, before settling on something that looked like barely controlled rage. But I still wasn't finished because I had been carrying other truths too, truths that I had kept silent about for too long, truths that needed to be said in front of witnesses so that Amanda could never again twist reality to suit her narrative. I looked directly at my son, at Daniel, who was standing beside his wife looking pale and uncomfortable, and I asked him if he remembered the conversation we had 6 months ago, the one where I had offered to help them with the down payment for a bigger house. I saw him nod slowly, saw him realize where I was going with this, and I continued speaking, telling the room that I had offered them $100,000 as a gift, no strings attached, because I wanted to help my family. But Amanda had refused, I said, not because they didn't need the money, but because she said she didn't want to be indebted to me, didn't want to feel like she owed me anything. And yet, here she was now, trying to take control of all my money under the guise of helping me, trying to manage my assets and make decisions about my life as if I were incompetent. I asked the room, asked everyone who was listening, whether that seemed like the behavior of someone who was genuinely concerned about my well-being, or whether it seemed like something else entirely. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. People were looking at Amanda with different eyes now, and I could see the social calculus happening in their minds, the reassessment of who was the victim and who was the villain in this story. Amanda tried to recover, started saying something about how I was misunderstanding her intentions, how this was all coming out wrong, but her voice had lost its confidence, had taken on a defensive edge that only made her look more guilty. And I realized in that moment that I had more power than I thought, that the truth spoken clearly and calmly in front of witnesses was a weapon that Amanda couldn't fight against with her usual tactics of manipulation and gaslighting. So I kept going, kept speaking, telling them about all the times over the past 3 years that Amanda had called me at the last minute, demanding that I babysit, the times she had criticized my parenting advice in front of the children, the way she had systematically tried to make me feel small and useless and burdensome. And with each revelation, I saw people's expressions change, saw them looking at Amanda with growing discomfort, saw the social support she had been counting on begin to crumble. Then I played my final card, the one I had been holding back because I wasn't sure I would have the courage to use it. I told them about the conversation I had accidentally overheard 3 months ago when I had arrived early to babysit and had let myself in with my key. I had heard Amanda on the phone in the kitchen, talking to someone about me, saying that she was working on getting control of my assets, that it was just a matter of time before the old woman was too confused to manage her own affairs, that they could probably get a court to declare me incompetent if they played it right. I had stood frozen in the hallway, listening to my daughter-in-law plot to steal my independence and my dignity, and I had quietly left and come back later, pretending I hadn't heard anything, because I had needed time to figure out what to do. And now, in front of all these people, in front of my son and his wife and everyone we knew, I was finally using that information, finally fighting back in the only way I could. Before anyone can doubt what I'm saying or try to dismiss it, I want to pause here and talk to you. Yes, you, the person watching this right now. I know what it feels like to be standing where I was standing, to feel small and powerless in the face of someone who seems to have all the control. Maybe you have someone in your life like Amanda, someone who makes you feel like you are too much or not enough, someone who takes and takes while pretending to give. I want you to know that your story matters, that your truth matters, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to be silent anymore. If this story is touching something in you, if you are feeling seen right now, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe to this channel, because I share these stories for people like you, people who need to know they are not alone. And please, leave a comment telling me what you are feeling right now. Tell me if you have ever been in a situation like this, because when we share our experiences, we create a community of people who understand, who support each other, who refuse to let the Amandas of the world win. You are not just a viewer to me, you are part of something bigger. You are part of a space where truth is honored and where people who have been made to feel small can finally stand tall. The room had erupted into chaos. People were talking over each other, some trying to defend Amanda, others clearly uncomfortable with what they had just heard, and Daniel was standing there looking like he might be sick, his face pale and his hands shaking. Amanda had gone very still, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips, and I could see her mind working frantically, trying to figure out how to salvage this situation, how to turn this back in her direction. But I wasn't going to give her that chance, because I had one more thing to say, one more truth that would seal everything. I pulled out another document from my purse, this one a legal paper that my lawyer had prepared just last week, and I held it up for everyone to see. I explained that this was a power of attorney document, properly notarized and legally binding, that gave control of my medical and financial decisions to someone I trusted in case I ever became unable to make those decisions myself. And the person I had chosen, I announced, was not my son Daniel, and certainly not my daughter-in-law Amanda, but rather my best friend from college, Patricia Reynolds, who was standing in the back of the room with tears streaming down her face. Patricia stepped forward, and I saw the shock on Amanda's face turn to something uglier, a kind of fury that she couldn't quite hide anymore. Patricia had been my roommate at university, had been the maid of honor at my wedding, had been there through every major moment of my life, and she was someone who would actually protect my interests rather than trying to exploit them. I had met with her and my lawyer 2 weeks ago and explained the situation, and she had agreed immediately to serve as my advocate, had even offered to testify about the changes she had seen in me over the past 3 years, the way I had become more withdrawn and anxious, the way Amanda had systematically isolated me from my support system. And now in front of everyone, I was making it clear that I had taken steps to protect myself, that I was not the helpless old woman Amanda had tried to paint me as, that I had agency and intelligence and people who truly cared about me. Daniel finally found his voice, stepping forward and saying my name in a tone that was pleading and desperate. He said that this had all gotten out of hand, that we needed to talk privately, that this wasn't how he had wanted this to go. And I felt a twist of pain in my chest because he was my son, my only child, and part of me wanted to believe that he hadn't been fully complicit in Amanda's plans. But I looked at him, and I asked him directly whether he had known about Amanda's plan to ambush me at this party, whether he had approved of the document she had prepared, whether he had been part of the conversation about declaring me incompetent. And I watched his face, watched him try to formulate an answer that wouldn't condemn him, and in his hesitation I found my answer. He had known, maybe not all the details, but he had known enough, and he had gone along with it because it was easier than standing up to his wife, easier than choosing his mother over his marriage. The party was effectively over. People were gathering their things and making awkward excuses, and I could hear whispered conversations happening near the door, people processing what they had just witnessed, reassessing everything they thought they knew about this family. Amanda had disappeared into the kitchen, and I could hear the sharp sound of cabinet doors being slammed, the only outlet she had for her rage, now that her public persona had been shattered. Patricia came to my side and put her arm around me, and I leaned into her, feeling suddenly exhausted, feeling the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright begin to drain away. We gathered my things, my purse and my coat and the birthday cards that some people had brought, and we prepared to leave. But before I walked out the door, I turned back to Daniel, who was standing alone in the middle of the living room, looking lost and confused, and I told him that I loved him, that I would always love him, but that I could not allow myself to be treated this way anymore, not even by him, not even for the sake of keeping the peace. As Patricia drove me home, I stared out the window at the familiar streets of my neighborhood, watching the houses blur past in the twilight, and I thought about everything that had just happened. I had spent so much of my life trying to be agreeable, trying to smooth over conflicts, trying to make everyone else comfortable even when it meant making myself small. I had been raised in a generation that taught women to be accommodating, to put others first, to sacrifice their own needs for the sake of harmony. And for most of my life, that had worked reasonably well. I had built a good life and raised a good son and contributed to my community. But somewhere along the way, that tendency toward accommodation had turned into something else, had become a kind of self-erasure that left me vulnerable to people like Amanda, who saw kindness as weakness and generosity as an opportunity to take advantage. And I realized that evening, driving through the darkening streets with my oldest friend beside me, that I had spent the last 3 years teaching my family that I was someone who could be pushed around, someone whose boundaries could be violated, someone whose autonomy didn't matter. The truth is that Amanda had been testing me for years, pushing a little further each time, seeing how much she could get away with, and I had failed every test by not pushing back. When she made snide comments about my appearance or my choices, I had smiled and changed the subject. When she called at the last minute demanding favors, I had rearranged my life to accommodate her. When she criticized my relationship with my grandchildren, I had backed off and given her space rather than asserting my right to be part of their lives. And each time I had yielded, I had taught her that she could take more, that there would be no consequences for her behavior, that I was an infinite resource that she could tap whenever she wanted. But tonight, I had finally drawn a line, had finally said no in a way that couldn't be misunderstood or explained away or smoothed over. And I knew that there would be consequences for that my relationship with Daniel would be strained or perhaps broken, that I might not see my grandchildren as often, that there would be awkwardness and conflict and discomfort. But I also knew that I couldn't go back to the way things were, couldn't return to being that diminished version of myself who accepted cruelty disguised as concern. Over the next few days, I received numerous phone calls and messages from people who had been at the party. Some were supportive, telling me they had always sensed something wrong in Amanda's behavior, but hadn't known how to address it. Others were more cautious, suggesting that I should try to reconcile with Daniel, that family was important, that I shouldn't let pride stand in the way of relationships. And a few, the ones who had always been more loyal to Amanda than to me, sent messages that were thinly veiled criticisms, suggesting that I had been inappropriate to air private family matters in public, that I had embarrassed everyone, that I should have handled things differently. I read each message carefully, responded to some and ignored others, and I thought about how we as a society are so uncomfortable with women standing up for themselves, especially older women, especially when it means challenging the narrative that has been constructed about us. We are supposed to be grateful, gracious, quietly dignified in the face of any treatment, and when we refuse to play that role, when we speak our truth loudly and clearly, people don't know what to do with us. I also want to pause here and talk to you again, because I know that some of you watching this are dealing with similar situations. Maybe not exactly the same, but close enough that you are feeling something resonate in your chest right now. Maybe you have been silent about something that has been hurting you. Maybe you have been accommodating someone who doesn't deserve it. Maybe you have been waiting for permission to stand up for yourself. I want to invite you to share your story in the comments, not because I want to be nosy or intrusive, but because I believe that when we share our experiences, we give other people permission to share theirs, and we create a space where truth can exist without shame. Tell me about a time when you finally stood up for yourself, or about a time when you wish you had, or about someone in your life who needs to hear this message. And if you have ideas for other stories you would like to hear on this channel, please let me know, because this space exists for you. It exists for all of us who have been made to feel like our stories don't matter. Your voice has value, your experience has worth, and I am here listening with an open heart and without judgment. 3 weeks after the birthday party, Daniel showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Tuesday evening, standing in the hallway with his hands in his pockets and an expression on his face that reminded me of when he was a little boy who had done something wrong and was waiting to see if he would be forgiven. I let him in, made him tea, and we sat in my small living room with the afternoon light slanting through the windows, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he told me that he and Amanda had been in counseling, that the party had forced them to confront some issues in their marriage that they had been avoiding, that he had realized he had been complicit in behavior that he wasn't proud of. He didn't make excuses exactly, but he tried to explain how it had happened, how Amanda's ambition and intensity had gradually taken over their relationship, how he had gotten used to going along with her plans because it was easier than arguing, how he had lost sight of his own values somewhere along the way. And I listened, not interrupting, letting him work through his thoughts, and I felt a complicated mixture of love and disappointment and something like grief for the man I had hoped he would become. I told him that I appreciated his honesty, but that I needed him to understand that this wasn't just about one party or one incident, that this was about a pattern of behavior that had been building for years. I reminded him of specific moments when he had stood by while Amanda treated me poorly, times when he could have spoken up but chose silence, times when he had prioritized his wife's comfort over my dignity. And I told him that if we were going to rebuild our relationship, it couldn't be on the old foundation. It couldn't be based on me continuously accommodating and him continuously taking, that there needed to be real change and real boundaries. He nodded, his eyes red, and he said that he understood, that he wanted to do better, that he had talked to Amanda about needing to respect boundaries, and that she had agreed, although he admitted that it was a work in progress. I didn't entirely trust that Amanda had truly changed her perspective. People like her rarely do without serious consequences and serious internal work, but I appreciated that Daniel was at least acknowledging the problem. Over the following months, we began the slow work of rebuilding trust, starting with small supervised visits, where I could see my grandchildren again. Amanda was notably absent from most of these visits, which suited me fine, and Daniel seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the constant need to manage everyone's emotions. We had difficult conversations about money and boundaries and expectations, and I made it clear that while I was willing to be generous with my time and affection, my financial assets were my own to manage and would remain that way. I also made it clear that Patricia would continue to serve as my power of attorney, and that this was not up for negotiation, that I needed to know I had someone in my corner who would advocate for my interests if I ever became unable to do so myself. Daniel accepted this more easily than I expected, and I wondered if part of him was actually relieved to not have that responsibility, to not have to navigate between his wife's demands and my needs. The whole experience taught me something profound about the nature of family relationships and the way we sometimes sacrifice ourselves on the altar of keeping the peace. I had believed for so long that being a good mother meant being endlessly available and accommodating, that setting boundaries was selfish, that prioritizing my own needs was a kind of betrayal of my role. But what I learned in the aftermath of that birthday party was that boundaries are actually an expression of love, both for others and for ourselves. When I allowed Amanda to treat me poorly without consequence, I wasn't just hurting myself. I was teaching my grandchildren that it was acceptable to disrespect their elders. I was teaching Daniel that he didn't need to stand up for what was right. I was teaching everyone in my orbit that Margaret was someone whose feelings and autonomy didn't matter. And by finally drawing a line, by finally saying this is not acceptable and I will not tolerate it, I was actually modeling something valuable, showing them what it looks like to have self-respect, showing them that love doesn't mean allowing yourself to be diminished. I also came to understand something about the particular vulnerability of widowhood and aging, the way society tends to view older women as somehow less than full people, as burdens or responsibilities rather than individuals with agency and desires and rights. When Robert was alive, people treated me with a certain respect that came from being part of a couple, from having a partner who could vouch for my competence and rationality. But after he died, I noticed a shift in how people interacted with me, a certain patronizing quality that crept into conversations, an assumption that I needed to be taken care of or managed. Amanda had exploited that cultural bias, had used it as a weapon to make herself look like a caring daughter-in-law, while actually working to undermine my independence. And I realized that this is something many older women face, particularly those who have lost spouses, this gradual erosion of autonomy that happens under the guise of care and concern. Looking back now, almost a year after that birthday party, I can see how transformative that evening was, not just for my relationship with my family, but for my own sense of self. I discovered reserves of strength I didn't know I had, a willingness to stand up for myself, even when it meant risking relationships that mattered to me. I learned that speaking truth, even uncomfortable truth, is sometimes the most loving thing you can do because it creates the possibility for real change and genuine connection, rather than the false peace that comes from pretending everything is fine when it isn't. And I learned that I am not required to accept poor treatment from anyone, not even from family, not even from people I love, that my dignity and autonomy are valuable and worth protecting. The relationship with Daniel is still complicated. We are rebuilding slowly and there are moments of awkwardness and strain, but there is also more honesty now, more willingness to address issues directly rather than letting them fester beneath the surface. Amanda and I maintain a cordial distance. We are polite when we see each other at family gatherings, but there is no pretense of warmth or closeness, and I am okay with that. The trust fund remains under my control, managed by my financial advisor with Patricia as my designated power of attorney, and I have actually become more actively involved in investment decisions and financial planning than I ever was when Robert was alive. I discovered that I am quite capable of understanding these matters when they are explained clearly, and I have even started teaching a financial literacy class for older women at the community center, sharing what I have learned so that others don't find themselves in vulnerable positions. I've also become more deliberate about maintaining my social connections and building new friendships, refusing to allow myself to become isolated in the way that Amanda had been encouraging. I joined a book club and a walking group. I volunteer at the local library. I take classes at the community college on topics that interest me. I am creating a life that is full and meaningful and entirely my own, a life that doesn't depend on my family's approval or participation, though I welcome their involvement when it is offered in a spirit of genuine respect and affection. The story I have shared with you today is not just about one birthday party gone wrong or one confrontation with a difficult daughter-in-law. It is about something much larger and more universal, the journey toward reclaiming yourself after years of making yourself smaller to fit into other people's expectations. It is about recognizing that accommodation and self-erasure are not the same thing, that you can be kind and generous without being a doormat, that setting boundaries is not selfish but necessary, And it is about understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to refuse to participate in dysfunctional patterns, to speak truth even when it is uncomfortable, to model what it looks like to value yourself enough to stand up for your own dignity and autonomy. I think about that moment at the party when I stood up and interrupted Amanda's presentation, when I decided to stop being silent and start speaking my truth. And I recognize it now as one of the most important moments of my life, not because of what it did to my relationship with my family, but because of what it did for my relationship with myself. What I want you to understand, what I hope comes through in this story, is that it is never too late to change the narrative. It is never too late to stop accepting treatment that diminishes you. It is never too late to reclaim your power and your voice. Whether you are 25 or 65 or 85, whether you are dealing with a difficult family member or a toxic workplace or a relationship that makes you feel small, you have the right to say no. You have the right to set boundaries. You have the right to prioritize your own well-being. And yes, there will be consequences. There will be people who are uncomfortable with your transformation. There will be relationships that change or even end when you stop playing the role that has been assigned to you. But the alternative, continuing to diminish yourself for the comfort of others, is a kind of slow death, a gradual fading away of everything that makes you uniquely yourself. And I can tell you from experience that the discomfort of setting boundaries is temporary, but the freedom that comes from finally honoring yourself is permanent. I have learned that family relationships are not unconditional obligations that require us to accept any behavior in the name of love. They are connections that should be based on mutual respect and genuine care. And when those elements are absent, we have the right to renegotiate the terms or even step back until things change. I have learned that the people who truly love you will respect your boundaries, will celebrate your strength rather than trying to undermine it, will want you to thrive, even if that means they have to adjust their expectations or behaviors. And I have learned that standing up for yourself is not an act of aggression or selfishness. It is an act of self-preservation and self-respect, and it is something that we all need to practice more often, especially those of us who have been taught that our needs should always come last. The version of myself that exists today, 1 year after that birthday party, is stronger and clearer and more authentically me than I've been in decades, and while the path to get here was painful and scary, I would not trade this clarity for anything. My relationship with my grandchildren has blossomed in ways I never expected, now that I am no longer approaching those relationships from a place of fear and accommodation. I can be fully present with them, sharing my interests and values without worrying about whether Amanda will approve. They are learning from me what it looks like to have passions and boundaries, to be kind without being a pushover, to value yourself while still caring deeply about others. Daniel and I have found a new equilibrium that is based on honesty rather than unspoken expectations, and while it is not the relationship I once imagined we would have, it is more authentic and ultimately more sustainable. And I have discovered a community of women, through my classes and volunteer work and social activities, who are also navigating the challenges of aging and widowhood and family complexity, and we support each other in ways that feel nourishing and empowering. I am no longer the isolated, diminished version of myself that Amanda tried to create. I am a full person with agency and voice and value, and I protect that version of myself fiercely now because I know how easily it can be eroded if I let my guard down. So here is what I want to leave you with today, this final thought that I hope will stay with you long after you finish watching this video. Your story matters, your boundaries matter, your dignity and autonomy matter, and you do not need anyone's permission to honor those things. If you are in a situation where someone is trying to diminish you or control you or make you feel like you are too much or not enough, I want you to know that you have the power to change that narrative, and it starts with a single moment of choosing yourself, of speaking up, of saying this is not acceptable and I will not tolerate it anymore. It might be scary. It might feel like you are risking everything. But I promise you that the version of yourself waiting on the other side of that fear is worth fighting for. You deserve relationships that honor who you are. You deserve to move through the world with your head held high. You deserve to know that your voice and your choices and your presence have value. And if the people in your life cannot accept that, if they resist your growth or punish you for setting boundaries, then they are showing you who they are, and you get to decide how much space they deserve in your life going forward. I think about the woman I was 3 years ago, newly widowed and uncertain, and so desperate for connection that I allowed myself to be treated poorly just to maintain the illusion of family harmony, and I feel such tenderness for her, such compassion for how lost she was. But I also feel grateful that she found her way to this moment, that she discovered the strength to stand up and speak out and reclaim her life. And I want to extend that same compassion and encouragement to anyone watching this who sees themselves in that earlier version of me, who feels trapped or diminished or voiceless in their own life. You are not stuck. You are not powerless. You are not required to accept whatever treatment comes your way just because someone is family, or because you have always done it that way, or because speaking up might cause conflict. You have more power than you realize, more strength than you know, and the world needs the fullest, truest version of you, not the diminished version that fits more easily into other people's comfort zones. The truth is that my birthday party confrontation could have gone very differently. I could have stayed silent and accepted Amanda's plan and allowed my autonomy to be stripped away piece by piece until I really did become the helpless dependent she was trying to make me. And there was a part of me, even in that moment, that wanted to do exactly that wanted to avoid the conflict and maintain the peace and just go along with what was being demanded of me. But something deeper and stronger rose up in that moment, some core part of myself that refused to be erased, and I listened to that voice instead of the voice of fear and obligation. And that is what I want to encourage you to do, to listen for that voice inside yourself that knows your worth, that recognizes when you are being treated poorly, that wants more for you than a life of constant accommodation and self-erasure. That voice might be quiet, it might be buried under years of conditioning and social expectations, but it is there, and it is telling you the truth about what you deserve. Looking forward, I have plans and dreams that have nothing to do with managing other people's expectations or fitting into predetermined roles. I am learning Italian because I have always wanted to. I am planning a trip to Tuscany with Patricia next spring. I'm writing a memoir about my years as a teacher and the lessons I learned from my students. I am living a life that is completely my own. And when people ask me about what happened at my birthday party, about the confrontation with Amanda, and the aftermath, I tell them honestly that it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, not because I enjoyed the conflict or the pain, but because it forced me to choose myself in a way I had never done before. It shattered the illusion that I could maintain family harmony by continuously sacrificing my own needs, and it showed me that real love, the kind that nourishes and sustains, requires honesty and boundaries and mutual respect. The relationships that survived that reckoning are stronger now, built on a foundation of authenticity rather than pretense, and the relationships that didn't survive were probably not as healthy as I had convinced myself they were. So as I close this story, I want to thank you for listening, for staying with me through this journey, for allowing me to share something so personal and painful and ultimately transformative. I hope that somewhere in this story you found a reflection of your own experience, a validation of your own struggles, or perhaps just the encouragement you needed to take that first step toward reclaiming your own voice and power. Remember that your boundaries are not walls meant to keep people out. They are bridges that define how you want to be treated and what you are willing to accept, and anyone who truly cares about you will respect those boundaries rather than trying to push past them. Remember that speaking your truth is not cruel or unkind, even when it makes other people uncomfortable. It is actually the most honest and loving thing you can do because it creates the possibility for real connection rather than connection based on pretense and performance. And remember that you are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm, that your well-being matters just as much as anyone else's, that you deserve to take up space in the world without apology or justification. Now, I want to hear from you, and I mean that genuinely, not as some formulaic call to action, but as a real invitation to connect and share. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and honoring yourself? How did you handle it, and what did you learn from the experience? Or maybe you are in that situation right now, standing at the crossroads trying to decide whether to speak up or stay silent. And if so, I want you to know that I see you. I understand the weight of that decision, and I am here to tell you that you have more strength than you realize. Please share your story in the comments below. Tell me about a time when you found your voice, or about someone in your life who needs to hear this message. And if you know someone whose story deserves to be told, someone who has overcome something difficult or stood up for themselves in a powerful way, please tell me about them in the comments or reach out to suggest their story for this channel. Because these stories matter. They create connection and understanding and hope for everyone who hears them. Your experience has value. Your voice matters. And this community exists to honor and celebrate the courage it takes to live authentically in a world that constantly pressures us to make ourselves smaller. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being part of this journey toward truth and healing and reclaimed power.